the first contact I had with Srila Prabhupada after having heard that he was starting a temple was that I was about to move into a place I was going to use as a sculpture studio for myself in Haight-Ashbury on Frederick Street. As a matter of fact, it was in 518 Frederick Street in San Francisco that I had some friends of mine had the place and they were turning it over to me. And my first contact with Srila Prabhupada in that sense was I was rather shocked to find that somehow he'd gotten it. My studio. Before I could move in, he'd somehow gotten it away, and I was very upset at that time, and I thought, what am I doing? What's going on here? I had this great studio, and now it's gone. And then I thought to myself, my heart softened, and I said, well, he's a yogi, and he's doing good, so I guess that's okay. You know, and so I forgave fate, little realizing what an amazing turnaround was going to take place. But the strongest presence I remember when I first met Srila Prabhupada was in Golden Gate Park. It was in 1966, or 66 or 67. I was standing there, and everyone was out. Hayagriva was playing trumpet. Somebody had kettle drums. There were gongs and cymbals, and incense was burning, and Prabhupada was leading a kirtan in, I guess it was on Hippie Hill or a hollow over there in the Haight-Ashbury, and in Golden Gate Park. And he sat there chanting, and I had developed some sort of psychokinetic powers because of lacking anything better to do with my energy. And I used to be able to play pinballs and move the ball around and do stuff like that, you know. So one of the things I used to do for pleasure, and it was sort of a interfering demoniac, basically, sort of pleasure, was looking at people when they weren't looking at me and making them turn around. So I thought I'd try that on Srila Prabhupada. Well, we didn't call him Prabhupada back then. He was called Swamiji, or the Swami. And I thought I'd make Swamiji turn around. And I stared and stared and stared, and nothing happened. And I looked at a bunch of other people that were standing around in the crowd, and they turned around very fast, just as though a bee had landed on their neck, you know. And I just sort of stared at Prabhupada again, and it didn't happen. I began to be very alarmed, and something inside of me became very determined, and I said, I am not going to leave this place until Swamiji, the Swami, turns around and looks at me. I want to know that I've made contact with him. And it ceased to be an issue of this ego control of wanting to make someone turn around, but I just wanted to make contact. And I went on and on. I kept on amping up my energy until I was breaking out in a sweat, and nothing happened. He was simply chanting, and he looked very ethereal, sort of as though he were floating in some sort of cosmic amniotic fluid, you know, and he was his kirtan, and he was moving flexibly and just totally unaffected. Finally, whatever energy in me that wanted him to turn around began to plead and actually beg. And the minute I became very sincerely begging, all of a sudden his eyes floated around to the side, and he looked at me, and it froze me for a moment. His eyes looked as though they were like whale eyes or dolphin eyes, floating in nowhere, some sort of golden light, and they were looking at me, and they hovered there for a moment that seemed like eternity, neither beckoning nor rejecting, just observing. I stood there, and my whole system collapsed from the inside out, and I just stared, and I said, oh my God. And all sorts of confusing emotions ran through me at that time, and I was standing there with a girlfriend, and I wasn't, you know, I was sort of, you know, a hippie-styled person. And outside, I was very confused. Inside, I had an overwhelming thought. I must go and straighten myself out and go to some place where I can really think things through, because I am not ready to become his disciple yet. My first impulse was to become his disciple. In the early days, the temples were so used to Prabhupada's personal association. And I might suggest that Prabhupada's association, particularly in the early days, particularly in a small temple, was so galvanizing that when Prabhupada was there, he was like a magnet, and everything else was like iron filings. Everyone knew how to act, everyone knew what to do when Srila Prabhupada was present. All things fell into place. It was very simple to be a devotee. It was very simple to be spiritual. If he said, this is how to cook dal, suddenly you became empowered to cook dal. If he said, this is how you chant, suddenly you were empowered to chant. If he says, get this building, suddenly you got this building. All you had to do was have enough suspension of disbelief to go ahead and do it. And by Prabhupada's direct kinetic personal presence, it happened. So we were so used to that, and then if he told people to work together on something, never mind they were enemies 10 minutes before, they could work perfectly together. It was very much like the lion lying down with the lamb, or Lord Chaitanya going through the Jharikhanda forest. Suddenly everyone spoke the same language, and it was very easy, because he took away the ego barriers that made it impossible to see the higher self, and to see the relationship with Krishna, to see his relationship with Krishna. All in all, you know, people talk about channeling. Prabhupada was continuously channeling Super Soul. Therefore, he was channeling the source of everyone's well-being. Everyone's answer was coming from Prabhupada, because everyone's answer is ultimately coming from Super Soul. So that when you saw Prabhupada, he was like the main branch of the bank. He had it all. He had all the information. So everyone was so used to that, that when Prabhupada went to another temple, everyone tried and tried and tried to maintain the standard. But being what we were, it gradually would sink down like silt in the stream. And then when Prabhupada came back again, all of a sudden it was all excitement and everything worked again. So in those days, we always managed that Prabhupada would go from temple to temple to temple and keep them all revived. When I did join, I joined just a matter of weeks before Srila Prabhupada arrived. So I'd been doing work, fixing up the temple, fixing up Sankirtan vans, and doing all sorts of work. And when Srila Prabhupada was due to arrive, they rented an apartment for him on Ashbury Street, I believe. And they told me, quick, Nara-Narayana, you have to do something and build an altar for Srila Prabhupada. So I actually went and I took pieces of wood and turned turnings, and I made an altar for Srila Prabhupada. Very simple, but altar, decorated it. So when Srila Prabhupada came, there was an altar, and he asked, who has made this altar? And they said, Nara-Narayana. He said, oh, bring him here. Actually, I wasn't named Nara-Narayana, I wasn't initiated. He's Nathan Baruch. So I came, and he approved. Actually, but before that time, I'd written a letter to Srila Prabhupada, and he had responded to me with my Karmi name. Before he actually came to Los Angeles, I wrote and said I wanted to serve Krishna in every way possible. And he wrote back and said, my dear Nathan Baruch, this is a very rare manifestation. I think you were a devotee in your previous life. To begin your service wanting to serve Krishna in every way possible means you have done devotional service before. He said, so please continue to do that, chant your rounds, do these services, carve deities. And he gave me actually these blessings through his very first letter, which was a letter which in itself was enough to keep me going for a lifetime. The first alone experience I had with Srila Prabhupada was in Seattle. At the time after I finished decorating that temple, he came up. It was a glorious success. And we found a horrible, they'd found a bad place for him, and he didn't like it. And Jayananda and Govindadasi and I went out in the middle of the night, in the middle of a fog, and were driving wildly around chanting and praying for a place for Prabhupada. We were driving up, I think, on Capitol Hill, and all of a sudden, in this dense fog where we could not even see the road, a sign emerged that said, for rent. And we said, that's what we were chanting, you know, that's what happened. And so not one of us looked like the sort of person you'd rent to, because we all had shaved heads, and Vandadasi was wearing so we heard Jayananda, who always looks pretty much like a ordinary, you know, Joe. He got out of the truck with without his short hair and wearing his Karmi clothes, went and rented the place. It was gorgeous. When we finally saw what it was like in the morning, it was a garden apartment with like windows, and when you looked out, you were looking into the flower beds, because most of the room was under the ground, and it was half a way out of the ground, so you could actually see beautiful lawns and flowers and stuff. And Prabhupada loved it. So in that room, Harsharani and Govindadasi were his servants, and he was living there, and I happened to come over for some reason or another, and we were all sitting in Prabhupada's room. Oh yes, Srila Prabhupada was talking to me about the possibility of going to New Vrindavan and building dioramas. He wanted to start a museum, fate museum type thing in New Vrindavan at that time. So he and I and another devotee were there, and then somehow or other, and I'm never quite sure how it happened, he and I ended up alone in the room. And it was Srila Prabhupada's room. He always had a coffee table, which he used as a desk, because he liked to sit on the floor. And he had an armoire next to it, a steel cabinet, such as he used to have in India, and in it he used to keep his correspondence and books and things like that. And Srila Prabhupada was behind the desk, and he was showing me, incidentally to doing something else, how he would open up an envelope with a letter opener, and then use the envelope for his reply, and then to save paper. and for his first draft, and then he drafted out again onto the letter when he had it down the way he wanted it. And somehow he had asked me to do something, and in the end, I ended up behind his desk, and he ended up on the other side. I was so on my toes and alarmed by the experience of being alone with Prabhupada. It was just like being with Queen Elizabeth or Indra or something of that sort, all alone. And he's like, oh my God, what am I going to do now? I have no instruction. I don't even know what to say, because I wasn't just initiated. And I had, been a part of the Hidashri. I was still sort of psychedelicizing a little bit. And Srila Prabhupada was standing there, and I'm sitting there totally mortified, wringing my hands and squirming my toes and wondering what to do next, and not wanting to leave by any means, but not knowing what to do if I stayed. Then Srila Prabhupada looked at me and said, we should always be considering what is my duty, he said. And I'm thinking, duty, okay. And I was been hearing impaired since I was young, and I didn't know that. And it's only the last few years I got hearing aids. So I didn't have any hearing aids. So what to speak of Prabhupada's accent and my inability to hear, I was having a hard time understanding, plus the psychedelics residually floating around in my brain cells. So Prabhupada points at this coffee table and says, do you see this ant? And I've been looking very carefully, and I know Srila Prabhupada is the external representative of Super Soul, that when Prabhupada says there's an ant, there's an ant. And I looked at the table, and there was no ant there. And he said, I said, do you see that ant? And I didn't know what he meant. I said, there's no ant. And I said, sort of like yes and no combined. Because I didn't want to say no and appear stupid to not see the spiritual or whatever ant was there. And I didn't want to say yes and be proven a liar because I couldn't see the ant and I didn't know where it would be found. So then Srila Prabhupada looked at me intensely as though that the ant issue now being solved, he wanted to get on to real business, and he said, my duty, he said, is to, my job, he said, is to understand what is my duty to this ant. I said, oh no. I said, not only there's an ant that I can't see, but now I have a duty to it. I said, what am I going to do? He said, somehow, Prabhupada looked at me beseechingly almost, somehow I have to help this ant. He said, and maybe I can chant, and he said, reaches down, he says, maybe I can chant Hare Krishna. Or he went like this, feed it a little prasadam. He said, if we can help one ant become Krishna conscious, then our whole movement is a glorious success. And then I realized it was a pure metaphor. That Prabhupada was aware of my bewilderment is pretty obvious. That he used it to make a point was excellent. And there I was, instructed by the invisible ant to whom I had a duty to feed and to chant, and that if I did so, it was our movement, whole movement was a success. We were in Columbus, Ohio, at that incredible time when Prabhupada led a kirtan at, I think it was University of Ohio or Columbus State or whatever it was. And everybody was so ecstatic they began dancing, but there was no place to dance because it was an auditorium. So they all stood up and were dancing on the handles of the armrests of the theater seats. Not devotees, everybody, thousands of students were there. And it all came about, they came there for Prabhupada and they came for Allen Ginsberg, and Prabhupada and Ginsberg did a joint program. And during that program, it was sort of interesting because they didn't find a thing for holding the microphone. There was supposed to be a wire that went around the neck and held the microphone. They couldn't find one. And Allen Ginsberg went to Srila Prabhupada and said, oh, Swamiji, I will give you my shoelace. And Prabhupada was very offended. He did not want to take Allen Ginsberg's shoelace to hold a microphone. And Srila Prabhupada looked at Allen Ginsberg as though he were like 3 inches tall and not made of a very pleasant substance. And Len looked at me and said, Nara-Narayana, Vishwakarma, you must give me, sacrifice your sacred thread. Now, he had told me never to take off the sacred thread and showed me how to wear it and to put one on and without taking it off. So he's giving me a direct instruction to take off my sacred thread. I felt exalted, like Joan of Arc being asked to be burned at the stake. I said, sure. And so I took off my sacred thread and handed it to Srila Prabhupada and said, thank you. Then he looked at a black look at Allen Ginsberg and put on the sacred thread with a microphone. Well, anyhow, the whole thing went fabulously, and Allen Ginsberg chanted, and Prabhupada chanted, and the thing was wild. It was just incredible. It was very exciting, and it gave a great boost to the beginning of the Columbus Temple. But after and before that time, Allen Ginsberg had flown in just for that purpose, and we had picked him up, and he was staying, I don't know if he was staying at the temple or not. I think he was staying in a hotel, but I don't know, maybe not. He might have been staying at the temple. But anyhow, I was designated to wash Allen Ginsberg's clothes at the laundromat. But he and Prabhupada were carrying on these great dialogues in a small room at the Columbus Temple. And there was room for a certain number of devotees there, and then there was not room for the rest. And sometimes I was in the room and sometimes I wasn't. But a bunch of us found out a way of monitoring the situation. In the next room over, there was a closet, and that closet communicated directly. So we drilled a hole through the wall in the closet, so there'd be like a dozen of us peering through a wall, a closet wall, at what was going on in the next room, trying not to cough or sneeze and revealing our whereabouts. So it was during one of those sessions that I heard Srila Prabhupada talking to Allen Ginsberg, and Ginsberg was talking about the nature of Kali Yuga. And Ginsberg was talking and saying, well, Swamiji, he used to call him Swamiji because that's the way he'd call in New York. And you know, Prabhupada and Ginsberg go way, way, way back. Ginsberg got him his first harmonium and arranged to help him get his temple. All these things he had aided. He was excited about Krishna consciousness. Although he never became a devotee, he was very enthusiastic about chanting the Hare Krishna mantra and used to hold kirtan all over the place on his own. So here we are peering through that hole in the wall of the closet in the Columbus Temple, and Ginsberg is there saying, well, he said, in Kali Yuga is going on, and Prabhupada was describing how bad Kali Yuga was going to get, how there would cease to be any foliage at all. There would all be carnivorous animals, and people would also be cannibals, that the fruits would be there, but the seed would be big, and the fruit would be just like a skin. There would be nothing to eat. And the devotees would be, what few there were, would be living in caves. He was describing the end times, Krishna conscious version of the end times. And Allen Ginsberg was saying, he said, and your disciples, they will be in the caves? And Srila Prabhupada looked at him as though he'd lost his mind and said, my disciples, he said, will have been back to God, will have gone back to Godhead by then. And Ginsberg was very impressed. He said, oh, really? He said, oh, yes. He said, they are very advanced. They are going to go back very shortly. They're chanting. They're taking part in this process. They are becoming pure devotees in this lifetime. They're going back to Godhead. And Ginsberg said, yes. And they said, what will happen to the rest of us? He said, Prabhupada leaned over to Ginsberg, and Ginsberg leaned over to Prabhupada, and they looked at each other face to face. And Ginsberg was straining to hear what Prabhupada was going to say, and Prabhupada said, Allen, in the end, I will eat you, and you will eat me. That is the end of Kali Yuga. Otherwise, you must go back to Godhead. When I was making the Kartamashad murtis, casting them, and Govinda Dasi was painting them in 1969, I made 18 of them because that's how many temples we had at the time. And I said, well, Srila Prabhupada, my task is over. I've made as many deities as there are temples. I guess that's it. And Srila Prabhupada said, no, you must continue. I couldn't continue because the mold went out, and I couldn't make another casting. But I said, really? Well, who will we sell them to? I said, we won't. I said, if we sold them to karmis, they might put them out on their lawn as some sort of lawn furniture, lawn ornaments like flamingos or whatever. And Srila Prabhupada said, if one karmi buys one murti and puts it on his lawn, our whole movement will be a glorious success. And I thought, wow, that's a lot different than the general gist of what we've been pursuing. The idea that any contact with Krishna is a good contact with Krishna. And it was from that point on that he encouraged cottage industries and was saying that cottage industry is the way the people should do, because you keep your family together in the house instead of going everywhere. And he was very much against that. He was always talking about the commuter trains. They are going so fast that way simply so that later they can go so fast the other direction. And that the train only enables people to live so far away that they never see their family. People are meant to live in the same house with their family and work there. Not everybody works together He said the grandmother works, the son works, the child works, the wife works. They all make something like the paintings in Puri or Rajasthan. It's a group effort. And it's all done by people that know how to do one part. And they make these products and they sell it and they stay together as a family and spend the rest of their time God conscious. So another interesting example of room conversation was later on in London in 1970. I'm sure there were many rooms in between and private conversations, but this one comes to mind. I had become, as a brahmachari, I was actually a householder, but living like a brahmachari, and living like that and chanting, you begin to wonder, am I going to get anywhere? I mean, certainly Prabhupada is proof positive that Krishna consciousness is not a fantasy, but a practical, normal condition of existence. I won't say human existence, but normal people are devotees. And there are more of them than there are us. We're weird trogdolites or something living somewhere else. But the real people are devotees, and they're happy, normal people that are perfectly fixed in the Atma Rama state of pure, unalloyed love of God. That's normal life. But what about me? Will I ever get there? So I was chanting my japa in the London temple, which is very small and very tall on Bury Place. And I just finished redecorating the whole place and fixing it up. And I was pacing back and forth in front of Srila Prabhupada's room, and I knew he was inside chanting japa. And I became overwhelmed by the urge to knock on the door and ask Prabhupada, am I going to make some progress? So I knocked on the door and regretted it immediately afterwards. And I sat there going in front of the door, worrying that Srila Prabhupada might answer or that he heard. And sure enough, he said, yes, come in. So I opened the door with trepidation, and I was even twice as scared as the first time I described. I came creeping into his room, and there he was, pacing up and down in this wonderful atmosphere that he'd created for himself with his japa bag in his hand. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. He was a Leo, so he was just charging along, saying, Hare Krishna. And I came in saying, oh no, I'm here, I've got to ask the question. So I shut the door behind me and crouched in a corner like a mouse. And Prabhupada looked at me and said, yes. And I said, Srila Prabhupada, he said, I'm chanting, I'm following the program, etc. I said, I keep wondering, is it possible that I could ever become a pure devotee? I mean, I see that you're a pure devotee. Can I ever become a pure devotee? I mean, I'm doing these things, but could I become a pure devotee? And Srila Prabhupada looks at me appraisingly and marches back and forth the room a few times. And every time he turns, he mutters to himself, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. And every time he turns around, he whirls around with his bead bag in the lead and says, Hare Krishna, and he charges across the room again. So he does that several times, and I'm getting more and more nervous because I'm beginning to wonder about the answer. And then he looks at me and says, why not? He says, you're in the process. I'm sitting there just melting like into a puddle of ghee. I'm so happy. He chants a few times, and he comes to a corner, he goes, Hare Krishna. He comes around the room, and he looks at me with a gimlet eye and says, but it may take some time. His level of compassion was just amazing. While we were beginning to think that only important service was important, while we were thinking that only big devotees were big, that monkeys were good for building roads to Lanka, but spiders weren't. Prabhupada was taking a totally different approach, and that approach was based on true compassion. He was taking the position that his natural concern for people was such that I remember one time in 1968, he wrote to Shamadasi. It was before I went out there in New Vrindavan, just after she had married Hayagriva. And it turned out she'd had an infection in one of her fingers. And he wrote 5 letters to Shamadasi, concerned about her finger. Now, that's not what one had thought in those days. We were thinking, oh, it's just your body, it's just made of stool and worms and blood and pus and all those nice things. Who cares about your body? Chop off the finger, continue to serve Krishna. But no, Prabhupada did it. And in those days, in all the temples, what we do is we Xerox the letters from Prabhupada and distribute them to all the temples. So every temple had a book of Prabhupada letters, probably 100 or 200 letters, and we'd collect them. So when everybody came and new devotees, we'd just say, oh, do you want to hear what a letter from Prabhupada is like? A letter from Prabhupada was sort of like the buzzword for, must be what ants feel like when they get their grain of sugar. A letter from Prabhupada. anyone's letter from Prabhupada was a letter from Prabhupada. What to speak of one directed to oneself? So I remember I was in the Detroit temple one time. I was sitting going through letters for Prabhupada, just noticing how much compassion he was directing towards one and all. I remember one time he cooked for his spiritual master's appearance or disappearance day on the La Cienega temple here. And he cooked a pot of khichdi, which he said was his spiritual master's favorite dish. And it is a wonderful dish. And he cooked it using urdal, which is not just a split urdal, but the polished urdal. So it came out with a very creamy consistency. And he made a pot about this size, about half full. And there were 30 of us in that room. And there are many other dishes too. So we started out by tasting the prasadam the Prabhupada had cooked, and everyone was in a jolly mood because it was a holiday, and we were observing the appearance or disappearance. I think it was the appearance day of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. And that picture of Prabhupada cooking at the stove is that occasion when he was cooking that khichdi. It's a famous picture. And we came out, and everybody got a dab of khichdi on their plate. And by that time it was cold. And I think Prabhupada wasn't there. He had already gone to his quarters to do things. And everybody was in a jolly mood. We were all talking and chatting. And we all reached over with our fingers, because in those days we ate with our fingers. And we picked up the khichdi and we popped it in our mouths. And all of a sudden this conversation died out everywhere. This was not some external ceremony that we were honoring this prasadam. We were not in the mood to honor anything. We were having a good time and chatting and jolly. As soon as that prasadam touched our tongues, we fell silent. We sat there in dead, icy, ice cave silence, tasting grain after grain of it until it was all gone. And then we searched for stray grains on our plates. And then everybody in the room, by common mutual consent, began crawling on their all fours towards the pot in the middle of the room where there was still a little bit left. And we all reached in simultaneously, and we were taking little pieces out of the pot. Our eyes were staring straight ahead. No one spoke a word until there was nothing left. Then we all went back and sat down and sat there in silence for almost an hour. Something about that prasadam was so charged with what must have been something like Gopi Bhava. It was too much ecstasy involved in that prasadam, that we were struck by it. Every feeling, the exquisite, excruciating feeling that Prabhupada feels for his spiritual master was present, and we had a chance. And then we realized that Prabhupada had given that to us like an extra special little present or benediction, that he'd allowed us to open the door a little bit and peek at what his world was like. Oh, there was a wonderful story about Prabhupada when we got to the land in Juhu Beach, that there was a family there that was airline pilots, and Prabhupada was going to be staying in their house. And their family name was Acharya. And we were just situating ourselves next door, and Prabhupada, when he was on a morning walk or traveled, he always had this flying wedge of disciples behind him. And he'd be leading, and they would all be sort of swept along in his wake. And we came up to the Acharyas, and they were standing at the top of the stairs. It was a tiny little house, but somehow it seemed very large at the time. And they were all standing at the top of the stairway, beaming and smiling and welcoming Prabhupada. And Prabhupada was coming along, and all of us were there. Knowing it was a small house, we were all planning to be the number one to crowd inside and sit down when Prabhupada was there, because he always said some wonderful things as soon as he came into someone's home and sat down. And we all wanted to be witnesses to those wonderful things. So he came up the stairs with his cane and turned in front of the Acharyas. They were standing there, the whole family. He turned and looked grandly over his disciple and said, "Ah," he said, "now I am finally taking shelter of the Acharyas." In Boston, he began to explain. He said, "A devotee may come and may go away again tomorrow." And in those early days, we looked at Srila Prabhupada and ranked disbelief and said, "Go away? But why would any devotee want to go away?" This is it. This is the perfection. This is where you go to after you've done everything else. Why would anyone ever want to leave it? But Prabhupada said, nonetheless, some devotees may go away. So we can't rely simply on word of mouth, because things will happen. Things will change. The words will be altered. He said, but we all listen to you, Srila Prabhupada. How will anything ever get altered? We'll always repeat what you say, and therefore it can't possibly get altered. Little did we know, but Prabhupada, having this prescience of knowledge of past, present, and future, was planning for 10,000 years, not simply planning for this week or this month or this year. And we were trapped in our time, having a wonderful time bringing new people into the movement, couldn't see the need. But Back to Godhead began to expand. We brought more and more books on board, and people began to distribute them. And it wasn't until much, much later, years later, that book distribution took off. And then it became self-evident as to why or how so many books could be distributed. And Prabhupada did sanction that people getting them might misuse them. And that was a casualty, or a friendly fire casualty, that we had to absorb, was the possible karmic reaction to giving someone a book and forcing it on them or something, and then they will throw it in the trash. It'll be covered up with old hamburger grease or something. So we had to accept that that might happen, and this is the risk that we were taking.
Shortly after I joined the Krishna consciousness movement in 1968, I joined just after Rath Yatra of 68, and Srila Prabhupada came into town in San Francisco. I was quickly transferred up to Seattle to build an altar and Vyasasan and things like that for Prabhupada up there. And in due time, Srila Prabhupada came up. This was in the fall or almost winter of 1968. So during that time, we had a little temple. It was a little cottage, a little house. It was full of the devotees from Los Angeles with the Sankirtan party, etc. And when Srila Prabhupada came there, we wanted to have a nice audience. And very few people came. As a matter of fact, really nobody came. So one time, there's some students from the University of Washington that came, a whole bunch of them. And we were so delighted because there's around 20 of them, and they'd all come in at the same time. And Prabhupada was giving a lecture, and we were feeling so good about this lecture and how nicely it was going on. And so Prabhupada is speaking, and we thought they were looking, interestedly at Srila Prabhupada. And all of a sudden, Srila Prabhupada stopped in the middle of the lecture, and he said, "Please do not try to misunderstand. Misunderstanding is already there." We were thunderstruck. That same time, I believe it was his Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's disappearance day, and he was describing at how he had been going on and on for many, many years. His spiritual master had told him to spread Krishna consciousness in the Western world. In a sense, it was only a few words that had been given. Just, you should go and spread Krishna consciousness in the Western world, in the English language. And many, many years had passed. And Srila Prabhupada had, of course, been making plans to raise money through pharmaceuticals, etc., to do this, and then his pharmacy burned down. But at some point, he said he began to see his spiritual master in dreams, and his spiritual master was saying, "This time to go." And he was thinking, he said, he was looking around. There was probably about 10 or 15 of us in the room at the time. He was looking around the room, and he said, "I was thinking how I can leave my children." And like that, I have my 4 children, how I can leave them and do this. And then he looked out, and it seemed as though tears like shot from his eyes. And he looked around us, his eyes were shining, and he said, "But now," he said, "I have got so many children." And from the way he said it, it gave almost the impression that the whole world had gathered inside that tiny little room in Seattle. And that we could envision, somehow there was never any question but that there would be a huge world movement. And yet, at that time, I think there were probably less than 70 devotees in the entire movement.
When I was in New Vrindavan, from New York, I went to New Vrindavan, and I'd hitchhiked there and got there very late. And we're doing work, getting ready for Prabhupada's arrival. We built a sort of a cupola on the attic room where he was to stay, and it's there to this very minute. Every time I go to New Vrindavan, I look at it. And I did all this sort of work there, and we were all working together. It was very difficult. There was no running water. There was no indoor plumbing. But anyhow, that's the sort of mood it was, both beautiful spiritual life and also very cranky atmosphere. A lot of people from Mott Street were there. A lot of former heroin addicts and gay people and whatnot were in that place. So it was a very edgy atmosphere. So
when Srila Prabhupada came there, he came into a midst of a bunch of people that were essentially squabbling. And every time they squabbled, they'd run upstairs and make their case in front of Srila Prabhupada as though he were the King Solomon, you know. So they kept running up and saying, but he said that, he did that, and Prabhupada would patiently try to put out the fire, and then the other guy would run up the stairs. So Prabhupada was pretty disgusted with all of that. One day Bhagavan came, and to me Bhagavan was just like the epitome of this positive-minded, energetic guy. And he and I hit it off immediately. We just liked each other immediately. And we went on to have interesting things to do in Detroit together and building up the Detroit temple. So he showed up, and as far as I was concerned, he was there. He got married to Krishna Bhamini. He took initiation on the same day as his marriage. To me, he was just the epitome of what is right about ISKCON, and he wasn't sniveling or whining or fighting or anything. So anyhow, Prabhupada came down the stairs one morning, and Bhagavan and I were there, and we saw each other. We grinned from each other, we ran over each other, and gave each other a huge, we're both very husky guys, we gave each other huge manly embraces, you know. We were embracing and just practically dancing in ecstasy. We were so happy about our Krishna consciousness and being there with Prabhupada. And we didn't see Prabhupada coming down the stairs. And Prabhupada came and he said, yes, he said, you should be in embracing mood, not in fighting mood. And from that became another key thing in my sense is whatever we're fighting about is very, very minor compared to this common work we have together. Prabhupada made it so clear to us that perfect or imperfect, we need to work together and spread Krishna consciousness. There's not us and them ever. There is no us, there is no them. It's just spirit souls and Krishna's lotus feet. And that's what I got from that statement. He was very pleased to see us embracing, and I was very glad to please him in that way. And so was Bhagavan. In 1969, after many false starts at trying to get a temple in Los Angeles, Prabhupada, we were meeting in garages where we would set up in the garage, have kirtan there, and then go. We had no temple at all. We got Prabhupada an apartment on Hayworth Street, which is up sort of near Cantor's Deli in the Jewish section of near Fairfax area, Fairfax district. So he had a nice apartment, very pleasant, upstairs. And during that time is when the first Gita came out, the one that was edited by Ray Rama. And there were some questions about it. And Prabhupada had been in correspondence with Hayagriva, who was living in New Vrindavan. And Hayagriva had mentioned something about thinking he might want to get married. And Prabhupada had told him, well, you're 27, better to get married before 30 if you're going to get married, because after 30, marriage is not so pleasurable to get married after 30. And so that was pretty much the end of it. And then he called Hayagriva to come from New Vrindavan, which in those days, traveling at that expense, etc., was sort of a big thing because we had no money. Hayagriva showed up, and we were to talk about the Gita and various other subjects. So we were all upstairs in Hayworth Street. I was also there. A few of us, maybe 8 of us were sitting. Prabhupada was sitting. We were all sitting next to Prabhupada in a row. And Shamadasi, who was one of the early devotees from San Francisco, very marvelous, somewhat eccentric, charming lady. Unfortunately, she passed away a year ago at Rath Yatra. But she's a very charming, eccentric lady, but very devoted. She was typing out the Nectar of Devotion. So if you read the Nectar of Devotion, Shamadasi typed it, transcribed it. I used to read over her shoulder while she was transcribing before it even was published. Well, anyhow, she was there, and she was a really good cook. And so she was cooking. So we were thinking, how nice Shamadasi's cooked for us here. And Prabhupada is tasting and relishing. We're all tasting and relishing very nice subjis. And Prabhupada turns to Hayagriva and says, pointedly but somewhat offhand, well, do you like the prasadam? And Hayagriva is a very intense guy, very quiet. If you read his books like Vrindavan Days or the Hare Krishna Explosion, you see a panoramic, full-color view of Hayagriva. But meeting him, he wasn't like that at all. He just would sit there and scowl most of the time and talk rather rough, you know. And he said, yeah, it's good, yes. So Prabhupada looked at him and smiled urbanely and said, being a good cook, being able to cook nicely, he said, is the first qualification of a wife. And Hayagriva nearly started choking on his food, staring at Shamadasi. Shamadasi's hands were trembling. He nearly dropped the pot of prasadam. I was sitting there with my mouth open, as was everybody else. Everyone was staring at Srila Prabhupada. And all of a sudden it dawned on us that not only this was a bombshell that had just been dropped, but nobody including them, had any inkling of it. So that was there, and Hayagriva gradually recovered his composure. Shamadasi was blushing through her gopi makeup, and everybody was totally astonished. But Prabhupada said, the first qualification of a wife is that she can cook nicely. So from that point onward, I began to realize that the home art of cooking is the key to Krishna consciousness, life, family life, etc. A woman who is a devotee and pulls out frozen dinners made by Stoffers is not quite spreading the movement in a way in which will be remembered by her grandchildren. Prabhupada lecturing at the Brahma Samaj in Nairobi. This is all in Nairobi in Kenya. And President Kenyatta, by the way, from our preaching activity there that time, that visit, said that it had overcome the overthrow of the Indians, as they called them, Asians, to be sent back to India or elsewhere, the way it had happened in Uganda, when Idi Amin had thrown out all the Asians, like thousands of them, and took their property, just to let them leave with what they had in their suitcases, like Jews being sent to relocation camps. That was on the verge of happening, and Prabhupada saved the whole situation for the Hindus. And that was how it was saved, at his ferocious preaching and crushing of demigod worship. So anyhow, we're in the man's house, etc. Everything's very nice. Later on at the Brahma Samaj, we had a big mela there, and Prabhupada is sitting, and everyone is sitting there. And Prabhupada has those disciples speaking, and everybody's trashing everybody, all the Indians, telling them why you have given up your culture, etc. Shama Sundar, Brahmana, everybody. I didn't speak, but everybody's speaking. Then Prabhupada speaks, and he starts talking, and he ends with this. Whatever he said, it ended with this. He said, Durga, he said, is riding on a tiger, and she has got 8 arms. In each of these arms, he said, there is a weapon. He said, one of these weapons, he said, is a trident. The trident has got 3 prongs, he said. And what are these 3 prongs? He said, it is the threefold miseries, Adidevik, Adiboshik, Adiatvik. He said, and what is she doing with that trident? He said, staring at them. He said, she is stabbing demons. He went like that. She is stabbing demons. Then he pulls himself up. And who are those demons? He cried out. He looks at the group, there are like 1,500 people in the room. He said, we are those demons. He said, whoever is suffering from the threefold miseries, is being stabbed by the trident of Durga. Then he looked, and his lip curled with utter disdain, and he worded like that with his hand. He said, and they are worshiping. So that is how he crushed Durga worship in Africa, and created a big base for real Vaishnava preaching without compromise. And that led to another series of events which saved all those Durga worshipping Indians from being bustled out with their handbags back to India or some other country, England or wherever, and be rejected. So Prabhupada saved everyone, even though the people in the room were absolutely stricken. They were in convulsions, literally, because of Prabhupada's intense words. But like the doctor may sometimes, even without anesthetic, cut away something in the body that is terribly injurious, and the person may scream, and later the patient becomes better, and leaving that cancer there, the patient would die. So better to suffer the pain even without anesthetic now. And then that's what I got from that. It was very, very nice. And I learned not to mince words, even if there was something at risk, like being left in Africa with no way to leave and antagonizing all of your friends that are helping you. So all these people that are handing Gitas to President so-and-so or Cardinal so-and-so, they should think, far more better to challenge Cardinal so-and-so than to hand him a Gita and pose with him with the Gita. He may hand it to his, get rid of this thing, later. Better not to get posed with it, better to preach from it, and then let the chips fall where they may. That's what Prabhupada did, and we are his disciples. In the early days of the movement, I heard Srila Prabhupada say to us, that Lord Chaitanya has created this movement. It is Lord Chaitanya's movement. You may think that you are conducting this movement and that what you're doing is important for conducting it. He said, but actually, even if you did do nothing and you should not choose to take part in this movement will go on because this movement is being conducted by Lord Chaitanya. He said, but if you take part in it, then you can take the credit, he said, smiling. So thinking along those lines, I'd been listening to Prabhupada in Bombay, and this is again in 1972. We're coming back from a walk on Juhu Beach, and just when we come up Juhu Beach to where the main land is and the roads and whatnot, there's, as usual on the beach, a bit of rocky area that you climb through. So just before we got to that, Prabhupada had been talking about the people becoming, 10% becoming Krishna conscious in the age of Kali. And more recently, I've had some time to contemplate the exact mechanism of Daiva Varnashram and how that will actually take place with the Krishna consciousness movement providing the Brahminical head to this Daiva Varnashram, etc. However, as he was talking, I was thinking of that 10%, and I was also thinking, well, it will already happen. It is predicted in Shastra, but if we take part, we'll get the credit. I was thinking like that. So I said to Srila Prabhupada, I said, well, Srila Prabhupada, you've just said that 10% of the population will take part in this Krishna consciousness movement. That will make it probably the greatest religion the world has ever seen since Vedic times, certainly in Kali Yuga. Huge, billions of people. And I said, since you are saying that, I said, but it's predicted in Shastra, 10%. I said, so why are we preaching if 10% are going to become Krishna conscious anyhow? Prabhupada was walking with his cane, and the cane had a little bit of piece at the top, so he put his finger on it like that. And as he walked along, he would be walking like that with his cane. All of a sudden, he whirled towards me, and he pointed his finger at me. The cane is going down, and his finger is going across the little bit that goes on the handle, and he points at me, and he looks at me totally intensely, vividly intensely, and he cries out, automatically, he said, 10% will become Krishna conscious. Then he looked at me more intensely. He said, but if you preach, why not 100%? And that's where I began to understand the difference between manifest destiny and free will. By manifest destiny, meaning Krishna's will, 10% will automatically become Krishna conscious. But if we choose, as Vasudeva says, I will not go back to Godhead until every being has gone back to Godhead. And so Prahlad Maharaj also said. I said, if we choose to preach, not me, everyone, or you, everyone, whoever wants preaching, why not 100%? And that I got was actually the mood of Thakur Bhaktivinoda. Prabhupada at one time said, he could have made everyone Krishna conscious, but he wanted us to have something to do. The Kalyana Kalpataru poem, he says, I've ripped up this tree and I brought it from Krishna Loka and I planted it. It's the choicest desire tree. But by my rough embrace, by rough handling, it is now doing poorly because I jammed it in the ground. Said, so I want everyone to come and water this tree. And if you water it, it will come back to its former glory, even though I have not handled it so nicely myself. So that mood of the Thakur Bhaktivinoda is that why not 100%? Let everyone come. Now 3 people come and water the tree, that's nice. But if everyone comes, why not? Why not everyone? Why not 100%?